to welcome everyone to our meeting tonight. And this is the United Lodge of Theosophists. Sunday night, we usually take up some topic of either general or specific interest, always from a theosophical perspective. Tonight, our subject has to do with Isis Unveiled, and the subtitle is The Origins of the Pagan Origins of Modern Religion. Well, before we get into that rather daunting sounding subject, I'd like to just say a few words about where we are and some of the principles upon which we operate here. The United Lodge of Theosophists is a voluntary association of students of theosophy. We make no pretension to being experts on the subject. We are all students of varying lengths of time and areas of interest. What binds students together are really three things. First of all, if you noticed perhaps on the door above the entrance on 33rd Street, there is a saying carved in the building. And it's from the Sanskrit, but we have it in English, so we all know what it means. It says, "There is no religion higher than truth." Now, this is sort of the fundamental cornerstone, if you will, of theosophy. The particular work here you'll find outlined in two places on our monthly program. On the first page at the very top has a motto. If the other is maybe a motto, then perhaps this is a more specific one for the lodge itself. And it says simply, to spread broadcast the teachings of theosophy as recorded in the writings of H.P. Blavatsky and William Q. Judge. This is really our purpose. And to that end, we hold classes such as this, study groups, short talks, over the years published a magazine. The program is found here, and you will also notice that on the third page of the program is a list of other lodges, each of which is an independent and autonomous lodge, an association of students, all bound together by a single document found on the fourth page. And it's called the Declaration of the United Lodge of Theosophists. And it basically outlines as if you will, a mission statement, a working, living document of purpose, and an identifying of what the means are of this work. And among the essential things that it mentions are that this is an independent association of students. Theosophists, wherever and however situated, are bound only by a similarity of aim, purpose, and teaching. And therefore, we'll find no formal or very few formalities except this document. And it's worked as a kind of experiment, if you will, in how students might best work together, learn together, and spread the ideas with as little formal structure as could be found. And we welcome anyone and everyone to associate themselves with this work. And it's what we won't read it at the moment, but we often read this at our meetings, just as a reminder of the purposes and the broader means by which our work is carried forward. Now, we mentioned theosophy. We mentioned on the program H.P. Blavatsky, William Q. Judge. The Theosophical movement is timeless. It is that broad movement of people and ideas which goes back into the night of time. It really is the journey of the human soul for knowledge, for freedom, for understanding, for reading the human family of dogmatism, of unbrotherliness, and for providing the tools, the spiritual, intellectual, moral tools of self-evolution. And we try to do that by not getting in the way, in each other's way, between the inquirer and the ideas. So we try to present as clearly as we can the fundamental principles of theosophy and to encourage their study and investigation. Now, H.P. Blavatsky, William Q. Judge, and others founded the Theosophical movement in the last quarter of the 19th century. But it is a timeless effort which knows no fully defining boundaries, because it's something that it can be found throughout history. It really represents the heritage, the spiritual heritage of human beings. So Blavatsky outlined three ideas he said were essential to understanding this philosophy. And she does that in a work she called The Secret Doctrine. The fact that she wrote it, I don't know how that makes it secret anymore, but we'll discuss that another time. However, what she said was that the first fundamental idea was that of an immutable principle, a fundamental ground, of which nothing really can be said, but if you look in all the religious philosophical traditions of the East and the West, you'll find this idea stated, sometimes hinted at, in all worthy philosophies and religions. She also taught that these ideas are as part of our heritage, the property of those that know. And simply, she said that they're the human beings, we call them adepts, great teachers, Mahatmas, whatever, that are the spiritual teachers of all humanity. The human tendency, of course, is to found religions on them. But essentially, their ideas are the same and are fair game for investigation. So if the first idea is, and we got off a little bit off track, but the fundamental idea of a fundamental identity of all life. Secondly, the cycles and give and take, night and dark, both on a physical, scientifically verifiable basis, as well as on spiritual and inner levels. The doctrine of cycles is an absolutely essential idea to understand theosophy. And thirdly, we call it the pilgrimage of the soul. That is the journey that each of us makes. And it's one that is not only possible for all human beings, but it's actually absolutely necessary. It is what if you will, it's in our spiritual DNA. That journey of the soul, the quest for understanding, seeking after wisdom, the quest for self-knowledge. So those are the kind of the broad outlines of this philosophy, its purpose, a little bit about the lodge here. We'd like to turn then to our subject on Isis Unveiled, but before we do, I'd like to, and we'll do this from time to time throughout the meeting in the next hour or so, take a moment and see if there are any questions. Doctor.
It seems that you mentioned the universality of theosophy. I would not expect you to have an answer, but maybe you speculate. Do you think other planets in the solar system have theosophy?
You're beyond my pay grade, Doctor. But we're given one of the ancient rules that has come down to us from the Hermetic philosophers is that as above, so below. As within, so without. So we have kind of a guiding principle, not a specific teaching about those other worlds, if you will, although there are things in the philosophy hinted at about the nature of the rest of our universe. But if we just use that as a starting point, one would imagine that if there are beings in the universe below us, we're taught, that are well below us, say, ants and beetles, and we only can imagine what their intelligence is, then there must also be higher spiritual realms of other intelligences. It would seem that if we use this rule and apply it, that there must be self-conscious beings of all sorts in realms we can barely imagine. As science has discovered, and in fact the scientists say themselves, particularly the physicists and cosmologists, not only is today, they will tell you, not only is the universe stranger than we imagine, it is stranger than we can imagine. So if kind of as a beginning point to try to answer your question, there must be all sorts of grades of intelligent beings. In fact, we're taught the universe itself is intelligence embodied. Any other questions on the beginning? Yes?
I heard it said that today's Theosophists are actually this era's Neoplatonists. What do you think of that? Is that true?
Are today's Theosophists this era's Neoplatonists? Well, yes. If by the Neoplatonists you would mean the philosophers of ancient Alexandria that followed Plato, but also were knowledgeable in the Kabbalah, in the Zohar, the other Greek philosophers, the Egyptian mysteries, the other mysteries of the ancient world, from China and India to the West, then yes, in a sense we're the inheritors, and in a very broad sense, Theosophists, because the term actually only dates from that time. The Theosophia meaning divine wisdom, not the wisdom of God, but that wisdom which one might say would be possessed of the gods. And so if that's our heritage, then we could do worse to say that we're the Neoplatonists, because many students find value, as Blavatsky did, in the works of Plato. We'll actually refer to a little bit of that tonight when we get into our subject. So will that be sufficient? Okay. Anyone else before we continue? Okay. We're going to talk about Isis Unveiled. Madame Blavatsky's first work, 1877, was a bombshell. It took the task of both science and religion, not for the facts of science, nor for the honest devotion of religionists, but for the abuses of each. And she basically went to the world and collected the information, or the evidence, if you will, of ancient theosophy. She took the role, in a sense, of the Neoplatonists. She begins with Plato in Introduction to Volume 1, and uses Plato as a model for the investigation of a vast variety of subjects, from religious experience to modern science, the science of her day, to psychic phenomena. The great phenomenon, of course, in the 1870s was spiritualism, and it was everything from looking for dear Uncle Henry's dear departed wife in a seance, to all sorts of other phenomena and things that science, for the most part, would not explain, and for which the only explanation from religion, at least in the West, was that it was the work of the devil. So Blavatsky took on this huge task in 1,500 pages in 2 volumes of outlining both ancient and modern references to this idea that there is a perennial wisdom, ideas that have been the heritage of the human family. And she gives chapter and verse, page after page, through 2 very large and fascinating volumes. The first volume, of course, devoted to theology, the second, to science rather, the second to theology. And what we're going to consider tonight, our subject on the pagan origins of modern religion. She gives us kind of a starting point at the very beginning of chapter 1 of volume 2. And she says, we propose to examine these facts from a different and perhaps rather novel point of view, that of the old philosophies as esoterically understood. We will use these facts as the standard by which to compare Christian dogma and dogmas and miracles with the doctrines and phenomena of ancient magic. So here she lays out kind of the broad challenge of this second volume. But it's interesting to note, before we get into the subject, what she says in her introduction to this volume. She says that were it possible, she'd keep it out of the hands of the really sincere Christians for whom their religion worked. She did not mean to disturb people's faiths if it was honest, but she did mean to challenge theologians, she meant to challenge science, and she meant to challenge the spiritualists who had a very narrow view of what phenomena they were observing. It's really a call to arms, in a way, a challenge to every dogmatically entrenched idea of the 19th century. Now, how well she succeeded, that's for each student to decide for oneself. But it did raise a lot of attention, brought attention to this Theosophical movement, helped to carry forward the Theosophical Society of her day, and to call attention to those spiritual intuitions that had no place else to go. Human beings naturally have, she says, a heart and need a purpose and know things intuitively. We need a rational philosophy, she says, that will allow that intuition, that intuitive spiritual heart, to flourish in an atmosphere of openness, of tolerance, and of appreciation of the human journey without entrenching any particular worldview, and certainly without empowering institutions to abuse and harm human beings, not just physically, but spiritually, intellectually, and morally as well. So, in this very first chapter of the second volume, Blavatsky kind of outlines where she's going to take the entire volume, this whole second volume on theology. And what we'd like to do with this kind of brief introduction then is to just outline 3 ideas that she shows are of pagan, if you will, esoteric, ancient origin. First of these is the Doctrine of Emanations. The second is some of the symbolism, and we'll just deal with 1 or 2 of those symbols. In particular, the image of the Virgin Mary with the infant Jesus. And thirdly, the Western doctrine of atonement. So, We won't be able to get into these entirely, but we don't mean to, again, using her as a guide, as an example. We don't mean to disparage the honest faith of anyone. But we do want to look at where these ideas came from. For example, what do we mean when we say pagan? What is the image that comes to mind in the West most of the time? Maybe it's gotten a little better, but for most folks, well, first of all, it means non-Christian, perhaps primitive. If it's not Christian and it's primitive, then perhaps it might be an adjective along with other words such as rite, pagan rites, or how about pagan sacrifices? Very common to associate the word pagan with some derogatory meanings. So we're not going to use it in that way. We're going to use it in a much different way, actually. We're going to use it in the sense of ancient, primitive in its best sense of being primordial, having to do with the origins of human beings, meaning really, really ancient. Another derogatory uses of pagan is actually the word itself. Does it mean country? No, we don't mean country in the sense of being nation-specific, but of being rather poor or low-born. Now, we mean it in a different sense, almost 180 degrees differently, of being highly spiritual. Because going back in the night of time, it's what anything pagan, pre-Christian, had commonalities with other, if you will, pagan doctrines. So if you take this idea of emanations, she says, we'll find that idea in every single ancient philosophy and religion. But what we end up with in the West, particularly, is we don't even call it the idea of emanations. We call it the Christian Trinity. And you have Father, Son, and Holy Ghost as a mystery that no one can solve. It's unknown. That's all we're told. And it translates in the West, or has translated historically, to the will of God. But in the ancient world, the doctrine of emanations was a highly sophisticated set of principles by which it was indicated that the unknown, we went back to our first fundamental proposition of the unknown reality, the fundamental ground of all. That fundamental ground unfolding on three levels. Now, in the Christian scheme, that came down to mean the logos from the Greek word for word. But in the ancient systems, it was all sorts of various combinations of deities, from the most spiritual to the most physical. So we could say the first trinities all had to do with the nature of consciousness as an abstraction. The second level of trinities all had to do with the intellectual world. That is what came down to be the idea of the sun. And the third level is always the idea of the creative deity. So in the West, when Christianity adopted these three and then did away with all semblance of them in just about every reference that they could do in the early years of the faith, they made the creative deity one with all the other aspects and forgot the abstract fundamental ground of unity. And without that ground of unity, it became real easy to differentiate those that were for us and those that are against us. So rather than a basis for understanding life as an unfolding whole, it became a tool of oppression. So Any questions at this point? I want to we'll take a break from time to time, and because we'll go on to the idea of symbolism in a minute, and then talk about atonement and its philosophical counterparts. Yes?
I know you missed this one, I had to step out, but given the 19th century and the entrenched view of the Western world and the demonizing of what we would call paganism, what were Blavatsky's sources? How did she come up with this?
Oh, great question. She quotes on every single page from the scholars of her day, from the translators of the ancient texts. Famously, well, she uses Frank's Kabbalah. She uses Isaac Basovy, the 18th century writers' translations of the work of the Manichaeans. She uses virtually all the Roman writers and the Greek authors. She uses Plato. She uses the scholars of her day, whether they were Hargrave Jennings and his work on the Rosicrucians, or Max Muller's works on the Hindu books of the East, sacred works of the East. She used anybody and everybody. A Frenchman, Jacolio, who was not very popular among the scholars, but she liked him a lot because he wrote about the origins of some of those ancient faiths, and fairly accurately too, in the early 19th century. So she quotes anyone that had a half a view, even an intuition, about the real antiquity of these ideas and of their spiritual, psychological, astronomical, astrological, symbolic, and philosophical origins, in however way that she could. So if you look through Isis Unveiled, hardly a page goes by that there's not a footnote quoting a note that she's quoting somebody. Now, her perspective, on the other hand, as she said in the little quote that we read, was that she would use the old philosophies themselves, Plato and everybody else, for a perspective on those teachings. So she basically let the philosophers speak and said, pay attention to what these people said they said, not what's been said about them. So she also said that elsewhere, later in the Secret Doctrine, as well as early in Isis Unveiled, she said these were ideas she didn't invent, but she was taught them by teachers of them. And she would go to anybody and listen to those that had something to say, whether they were known in the West or not. Sometimes she quotes people that it's only been decades or 100 years later that we find out that, yes, the only copy of that work happened to be in the Vatican. How she got it, nobody knows. But the point is that she was pretty accurate in her sightings of both ancient philosophers and those modern writers that were becoming, had come a long way toward appreciating the ancients. She quotes the Christian writers and uses them to show the original meanings of ideas, such as the Doctrine of Emanations, and shows how they've changed over the years, how they got distorted, how they got used, how they were used to control and to govern. So I hope that will suffice. Yes?
Well, sometimes people have the impression that what HBB did and what Theosophy then represents is sort of that HBB looked around in the world, found interesting things that were sort of true, put them all together, sounded good, put sort of a ribbon around it, and that's Theosophy. Mm-hmm. And there is certainly, sometimes that word is used, eclectic Theosophy. Mm-hmm. And like she herself says in the Secret Doctrine, all I've done is took the best part of all those religions and put a rope around it, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
But Theosophy in and of itself is not eclectic, right? It's actually, she claims that there is a knowledge that lies at the root of all religion and philosophies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's quite different from a supposed eclecticism.
Well, yes, and a little bit of no. Because if one looks only at the external form of these ideas, and all you wanted to do was to collect and document the existence of those doctrines, philosophies, sciences, or what have you, you could do a pretty good job of just collecting information and then distilling out of those certain principles. In fact, that's what ISIS Unveiled basically did, was to take all of this collection of things after a kind of a brief introduction, to say what she was looking for and looking to do, go through 1,500 pages of data, and at the very end of the last chapter in volume 2, come up with 10 propositions of psychology. She says, this is the essence of what we've tried to show, distilled from all those pages. So in a sense, it's possible to be eclectic if one wanted to approach Theosophy as one would a scientific discipline. One could also, on the other hand, approach it like she does a little more so, or much more so, in the Secret Doctrine. And that is, begin with certain propositions, and then proceed to lay them out as to how those unfold. Now, both methods work in terms of the world. The first, you might say, is the scientific method, and in a way pioneered by Aristotle. It's called the inductive method, and it's valid. It works. For those with minds like that like to see the information and then sort it out later, and that's a part of the human nature that likes to do that, it's a valid approach. For those that would rather take an approach that, say, mathematics follows, where you lay out your theorems first and try to prove them, you might say that deductive method, the method of Plato, begins with first principles and shows their manifestations as they unfold in nature. So we could use both methods, and they both work. They're both educational, and they both call upon both our ability to reason and our intuitions. They call on our hopes and our dreams and our aspirations. They call on our highest spiritual intuitions. But they also call on our practical faculties. In fact, the entire Theosophical movement, its fundamental principles are, in a sense, a distillation of both methods. In the first formation of a nucleus of universal brotherhood. That's the first object of the movement. Still the first object of all the theosophical groups, all the theosophical societies, still have that as their first object. The second, study ancient, modern science, religion, philosophies, and show the demonstration of the importance of that study. And third, investigate. Investigate nature, investigate the human being, investigate, in the words of the original, the psychical powers latent in man. So all of those kinds of investigations are valid avenues for exploration. And often it depends on individuals' own intuition as to what is most appropriate for them. Sometimes it may just depend upon what we're exposed to first. Or it might depend on what we read first, or which book seemed to resonate best with us. Or I guess it comes down to what our individual karma might be as to where we are in our own journey of the soul. So it's useful, yes, to have both methods. So I think they both have their place. And the last thing Theosophy wants to do is to put its adherents in a position of telling others what they ought to do. You ought to study this. You better not. Now, we can, in this lodge, we have a focus. Doesn't mean individuals aren't welcome to study things that appeal to them outside the Theosophic literature or outside the circle of ideas. We don't go around asking people what they believe and what they don't believe. It really is an individual matter.
Mr. Crosby felt like that the safest method was to start with the most universal and then work downward.
Well, that's an interesting way to put it. The safest method. Safest for whom?
Well, like, for example, the SD starts with the stanzas of John.
Okay.
So it's based on those very short group of stanzas.
That's true, and it's a perfectly valid place to begin. One could just as easily in another culture begin with the Orphic hymns. One could begin with the laws of Manu. One could begin with the words of the Buddha. Others might begin with a red letter edition of the New Testament.
King James.
Well, the point is to go to read what the teacher said, or reported to have said, not what was said about him. Blavatsky, again, going back to the introduction of Isis Unveiled, she said, we write not one word against the courageous prophet of Nazareth. Why? Because he spoke the truth. Now, what's been done in the name of that great teacher, she had a lot to say, and it shows how it was adapted. But there's nothing wrong with starting with those first principles. Wherever one is where one ought to begin, and that certainly is a valid place for one's, to begin as well as to continue one's education on these kinds of things. Okay, let's go on just a little bit. One more hand. I'm sorry.
So, Theosophy believes in this idea of cause and effect, and so throughout history, what might be the cause of why paganism was kind of overcome by Christianity, or what might be the why did this happen? If these are the ancient, truths.
That's the $64 question. What happened? Well, I guess we could try to sum up the way she explains it, and it's really due to a couple of things. One, of course, is human nature. It is the nature of humans to want to form institutions, to crystallize ideas, to make things more concrete rather than more abstract. It's also human nature to want to, in some way, control our environment. So, if that is true, one of its manifestations is selfishness. And the kind of selfishness that grows institutions is the kind that fears the world. So we have a lot of that in the process of early Christianity, and this is just one example of many, but early Christianity first adopting the ideas of the pagans, of the esoteric schools, of the Kabbalists, of the Theosophists, the Neoplatonists, adopting their doctrines. Second of all, of changing them to suit their needs. And thirdly, of literally persecuting and destroying the competition. So there's just one explanation. The other explanation is a little broader and maybe a little harder to see sometimes. We would call it a result of the doctrine of cycles. That there's a natural ebb and flow to ideas like anything else. There's an ebb and flow to civilizations. There is a natural coming to fruition and then a decline. Now, it may not be quite as literal as, say, that 18th century historian Gibbon when he wrote about the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, But still, those things seem to occur. And even 20th century writers were known to write about the infancy, the childhood, the maturity, and the decline of civilizations, and to speculate about those same cycles as applied to us. So if there is a natural ebb and flow in cycles, which are part of nature, then maybe that's one of those things that's going to happen in some way or another. Maybe not to the extent that it did, but it certainly might explain some of that broad history.
I think it is, in particular, the third point that you pointed out, the cycle turning downward or becoming more material. That was the major contributing cycle to the rise of Christianity, because HVB herself points out that a lot of those pagan religions were slowly ending up in black magic practices, and the main reason for it was the demise and corruption, you could say, within the mystery schools themselves. That the new adepts became less and less and less in quality until the inner meaning of things was lost. And that contributed largely to opening up the doors, so to speak, for a more, you could say, materialistic approach, because basically Christianity is just materialism, a personal God, a guy with a beard in the sky, or however you want to represent it, an objective devil. You can't get more material than that.
Right.
And that all contributed then to the rise of Christianity. Because also those within Christianity, who used to be pagans, primarily lost that insight as well.
It's a very complicated and very intriguing kind of history to read how these ideas got changed, got adapted, and how those once really spiritual schools became corrupted.
Well, even in Plato's time, they were already complaining about having to pay for the mystery schools. So that's already 500 years BC. So there's already that corruption setting in the demise slowly. But it's societal.
Yeah. Well, that perhaps is part of the explanation. It's also a hopeful explanation, because anything that can turn down and cycle downward can also be revived.
So where are we in the cycle?
Well, that's hard to tell. We'd like to think that there has been something of a revival in interest in at least the works of Plato and the work of the Buddha. Buddhism is now a fairly major contributor in American life, whereas 100 years ago there was, well, actually there were no Buddhists 100 years ago, or almost none. The first one that was the first Western Buddhist we know was Henry Steele Olcott, who was president of the Theosophical Society. When he and Blavatsky became Buddhists in Sri Lanka about 1879 or 1880, and it was quite a newsworthy item. Went around the world. What? Westerners became Buddhists? What is that? So we like to think that the influence of the Dalai Lama. People go to see him that would 100 years ago wouldn't even have known anything about Tibetan Buddhism. So there's a lot that's happened. The scholars that HPV refers to, had she written 20 or 30 years earlier, a great deal of what she quoted would not have been available, at least not in the readily available and readily quotable books that had come out in the mid-19th century. So we like to think that perhaps there's been something of a Neoplatonic revival, interest in the works of Plato, of course. So it's hard to tell. We're too close to it. We're also too close to the negative signs in our cycle. I mean, we're the ones, people alive today remember the first atomic bomb. Hardly an example of universal brotherhood.
Well, whenever you have light, a shadow is thrown.
There you
of
are.
course.
So, did I miss any other questions? Okay. Well, we mentioned the Doctrine of Emanations, and I just wanted to just kind of go over that just a little bit before we go on to talk a little bit more about symbolism. Where did I put that? I've got it on Plato here. Well, anyway, we'll may have to go past that one for the moment.
Is it beyond our pay grade, or?
No, something's beyond your pay grade. I just can't find the quote I wanted to use. Well, we mentioned Plato, and of course, Plato had this theory of ideas, which, as Blavatsky points out, is kind of a blind for this doctrine of emanations, because it's a very powerful kind of idea. You find the same thing in the Kabbalah, you find it in Hindu literature. Every deity in the ancient world was threefold, and Christianity was no different. This is what's really interesting about this idea, is that there was always, well, the Hebrews called it Ensof, no thing, Ensof. And that unspeakable principle is the ultimate deity in all the ancient philosophies. But what you have in manifestation, in a sense, that's the Father. And then there's always the Son. The Son in Plato is the intellectual, or the formal world, okay, the ideal world. And then you have the creative world. And all the solar deities, the creative deities, whether it's Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, or Jehovah, is always that third level of the Logos. So it's always that active potency in nature. So in a sense, theosophically, it's our higher principles. Principle Atman, universal spirit. Blavatsky called it, like in the key to theosophy, it's like sunlight. It's not something we own. It's universal, common to all. Buddhi, intuition, direct perception, spiritual ideas, and then manos, or mind. The mind, the fire of active engagement in the world. These three levels are always in sequence, and in a sense, the real deity of nature and beyond nature. And there's always that overriding presence, the unknown, and software, whatever else it's called. And these three levels of three powers and the highest are what is shown in the Kabbalah. Kabbalah has those same kinds of principles laid out for the student to examine there. What the Christians did was simply take the idea of the Father, Son, and the indwelling Spirit, roll them all up into one, and said that's God. So we have this tradition in the West. You get people that will say, well, Christianity or Judaism is really the first monotheistic religion, and Christianity is a monotheistic religion. Tell that to all the Christians from the first century onward, all the way up till the present day, particularly the Catholics. Father, Son, and Holy Ghost is a Trinity, the last time I counted. So you have this idea which got borrowed, it got simplified, I guess, you might, for want of a less generous term. And then, as what happened with the mystery schools, they closed They closed what they could. They persecuted the rest, and just ran everybody else underground. So for 1,000 years, in Europe at least, you had one church, one set of doctrines, actually one set of dogmas, and a controlling interest in everything that happened on the part of the clergy. So you could say, yes, it's just a cycle that came to an end, but it was 1,000 years of some pretty awful life. And it's based on a philosophical idea turned on its head. That's the interesting thing about philosophy, is you can take a spiritual idea, turn it on its head, and make a controlling factor in human life. It's the danger of spiritual ideas. They are very, very powerful. Yes?
One of the other things that happened was that because most people couldn't read, most people were not encouraged to think for themselves, you therefore had the fear of damnation, which makes no sense with an all-loving God, but that's another issue.
Sure.
But one of the strengths that HPB brings forth, especially in the second volume of The Secret Doctrine, is her very clear-eyed and almost loving analysis of the Old Testament stories, which of course became the basis for much of theology, and looking at the real meaning of the Garden of Eden, the real meaning of the book of Genesis, and not in the sense of you have a literal interpretation. Then you have the inner interpretations that all true religious thinkers, no matter what they identify themselves as, have an understanding of. So when she's bringing that back to view, it's a reminder that it's always there, sort of hidden in plain sight. And I think that applies to our own natures too, for ourselves.
Sure, sure. Well, those ideas, the images that we associate with in the West, largely with Christianity, almost every single one of them has been borrowed. We're all familiar with the image of the infant Jesus being held at the breast of his mother. Well, the fascinating thing is, if you look at reliefs from ancient Egypt, pictures going back 2,000, 3,000 years in papyrus or on temple walls, you'll see the same image of the infant Horus at the breast of Isis. It's exactly the same image, has exactly the same, the same aura or light behind the infant's head. Isis is wearing the same crown that you will see in the Middle Ages depictions of Mary, mother of Jesus, and it's the crown of Upper Egypt. But here it is on reliefs that are 3,000 years older than Jesus, and yet clear as day, the exact same imagery. You take that, you add it to the cross, you add it to the tree of life, add it to the crook of the shepherd, Jesus, and you go back to ancient Egypt, you go to India, you go to ancient Chaldea, way older than Christianity, you'll find exactly the same image on religious carvings, on temple walls, in religious scriptures of all kinds. Even the language is the same. The mother of Krishna is Maya. Maya is Mary. Mary, the mother of Jesus, means the ocean, the sea. Again, is primitive. It's not primitive in the sense of being simple. It's profoundly esoteric. But this primitive idea, the primitive symbols are always the same. The interesting thing, and Blavatsky points this out later in Isis, is that the one thing Christianity added that none of the other religions did. And that was to make the statement that it was unique. Every other faith in the ancient world would always point to its teacher, and its teacher would always point to the ancients. So you have Plato, who points to Pythagoras. Pythagoras points to the Egyptians and to the adepts of the East, of India. If you go to India, you'll get Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, and he will make the statement that this was the ancient wisdom that was formerly taught, beginning with mine. So they always point back to their teachers. Never claim to have invented anything until you get to Christianity. And then you have this astounding idea that Jesus is the only Son of God. Not just a Son of God, we'll allow them that one, I guess. But the only Son of God. We need to put it in context. Blavatsky wrote Isis Unveiled in 1877. In 1870, there was I guess you'd say wonderful, and put it in big quotes, an ecumenical council. Pope Pius IX set out a whole bunch of encyclicals. And one of the things that they wrote was that those who die without the benediction of the church go to hell. That's it. It's over. Therefore, all of the pagans that didn't know Jesus and everyone that didn't get the opportunity to be saved is going to hell. Now, we're not quite sure how that works logically, and she spends many pages in different times in the second volume of Isis, kind of pondering over this whole idea that it's possible for human beings to be damned eternally for something that they had absolutely no control over. And then she examines the third thing we'll only mention for a couple of minutes, and we'll turn it over for more questions. Doctrine of Atonement. The idea that the Savior basically took on all the sins of humanity, and that belief in the Christian Savior would send one to heaven. And she gives several examples of some notorious criminals of her day that were given the final rites before their executions because he calls them do-gooders. The do-gooders wanted to make sure that they got to heaven. And the only way they could be sure would be to get them while they had just confessed. So you have those that are the worst offenders against the universal brotherhood, humanity. They go to heaven because they got saved. Now, she says, where did they get this idea of the atonement that some other teacher, that someone else could basically die for us? And she discusses it as a perversion of the whole idea of initiation. And elsewhere in the Secret Doctrine, she talks about how it really is the idea of the human soul that takes on the burden of incarnation. And so elsewhere she uses the analogy of, or the story of Prometheus, who is the Greek Titan, steals fire from heaven and gives it to humanity. Why? He feels sorry for those in the dark. Now, is he a savior? Absolutely. He brings the fire of mind to humanity. But he brings it as a gift, and also as something that's due in its own cycle. But it's not something that is given just to a few. It's something that's universal and is shared. So we have in a sense, a description based on human nature, real principles of our being. And and an explanation for what otherwise would be a rather cruel doctrine, that of vicarious atonement. Because the real sacrifice is our spiritual nature, which incarnates in form. And this idea we find throughout the ancient writings, this idea of the spiritual teacher, the journey of the soul, and the necessary pilgrimage. It comes out again and again in stories of heroes, in the stories of the great teachers, in the symbology, the mythology of all the ancient world. And we have it in an echo in the religious traditions in the West. And so it's useful to look at these ideas from this perspective of them being universal truths that have just been adapted and sometimes cruelly changed to suit what would seem to be short-term purposes. So let's in our last few minutes here have some questions.
Do you think the doctrine of atonement can be discovered by looking at a teacher's responsibility for the students?
Certainly. The teacher that knowingly tries to teach, or maybe not even knowingly, but the teacher that is trying to share, the parent that's trying to do their best for their child, in a sense, takes on some of that child's karma. And so we have that, but in a different context and in an entirely different meaning. Mm-hmm. Because the child still has to walk. The teacher can't walk for it. So there's a certain amount of necessary pain, you might say, in being a learner. And the teacher can point a direction, but can't do it for us. And if we keep that in mind, it helps, just that simple analogy that you pointed out, it's a very useful comparison. Mm-hmm. Yes?
In case of Christianity, it goes back to where I see that Christianity became the official religion of Rome, Empire of Rome.
Yes.
And I believe it. But on the other hand, there was another stream, so heretic.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right.
I would be interested in hearing something, you familiar with Isis and Leo. She's done something of this. Because I think in those Greek mysteries and...
Mm-hmm. There was a lot going on in those early years, sure. Well, you've mentioned a couple. The Gnostics were basically a varying group of often very religious inquirers and teachers. Some took on the outer garbs of Christianity. Others were quite eclectic. Others looked more like groups of Buddhists. So yes, there were those that have come down to what's called the Hermetics, the Hermetic tradition in Egypt. There were certainly the mystery schools. There were both the popular mystery schools, and there were those that were secret. And in each were a wide variety of different approaches. And some had rather ordinary public rites. Others had very, very secret and very mysterious rites that they shared with no one. So it really, then there were the public Platonic academies in Alexandria and in Rome and in Athens, places that one could go to be taught. Either some variant of Plato's philosophy or followers of several others that use Plato sort of as a basis. But all at one point were pretty much allowed to coexist. Eventually, though, by about the 4th century, the writings of the 2nd century fathers started to be applied. You had writers in the late 2nd century, or early 2nd century, Tertullian, Irenaeus, those that helped to define early Christian dogma. Well, they finally got an audience when a fellow by the name of Constantine became emperor in the Roman Empire. And therefore, those that after Constantine, all the emperors, or most of the emperors, were Christian. And those that disagreed were called heretics. And eventually they, by the early 6th century, Justinian closed all the mystery schools. They closed the academies in Athens and in Alexandria. And pretty much anyone that wasn't Christian wasn't welcome. I made it pretty clear that those were not allowed to remain. So, does that answer? Is there something in particular that you wanted to discuss?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's very complicated.
Well, it's complicated because it's a complicated time in human history. You have all sorts of religions, some we don't even have today. The teachings of Mani, who was a 3rd century Persian, Doctrine of Manichaeism, was kind of a Zoroastrian philosopher, but also a religious man that taught the doctrine of twin universals, kind of a conflicting kind of idea. But you had, good and evil as sort of the co-eternal pairs of opposites. Well, the philosophy of Mani was a religion of, again, the Manichaeans in the 3rd and 4th century there were millions of people that were Manichaeans. And they all disappeared by about the 6th or 7th century. Largely, by the 8th century, by the time the Muslims came through Persia, pretty much eliminated the Manichaeans. So there's all these different groups that at one time were not only allowed to exist, they flourished.
Well, on
Yes.
that one, if I may, one of the things HPB points out to is that even in times of darkness, there's always a thread. There's always somewhere where the wisdom religion is protected, so that it can come back when the times are right. And that brings up the idea that she points to quite often of the beings that choose to keep that wisdom somewhere, somehow. And it's a reminder that there's far more going on than meets the eye, without being spooky about it, but that there is a continuation, so to say.
The other thing is we have actually very little information about that period. When you come down to it, the repositories of information almost all had to come through the Christian church. And so there was, as these various groups were closed off and closed down and persecuted, their writings also began to disappear. And so you had, for example, the famous Alexandrian libraries. The Brookean Library, which at one time had over 1 million scrolls on a wide variety, not just philosophy and religion and so forth, but on medicine and law and chemistry and science and astronomy and alchemy and astrology, archaeology, the works of the ancients on how to build and how to make and how to do things, as well as all sorts of subjects. Anything that a modern library would have, and then some, was burned 3 times. So when you have that kind of destruction, some of it was inadvertent, as we think under Caesar, but also sometimes it was done on purpose. And so what was left was intentionally brought underground. So we've lost so much of the ancient wisdom, at least what was the known flourishing of that. And so it's interesting to look at the Theosophic idea that there have always been those, not just traditions, but those that do, those that preserve those ideas in whatever way it was possible to do so. That's part of our heritage. So if we have groups that we think of as heretics today, no telling what they might have at one time, or maybe still managed to keep. In the 20th century, we certainly have had many things come to light. Dead Sea Scrolls, Nag Hammadi Library, some of the finds of ancient Egypt. There's been all sorts of things that have come to light that give us a whole different view about what happened in the ancient world. This wasn't known in HPV's time. She hints at some of it, but there's still relatively little that we actually know about the ancient world. No. Yes?
How does Hypatia fit into this scheme?
Well, she fits in because she was the last of the Neoplatonists. And early in the 5th century, she got caught in a political squabble between the magistrate of Alexandria and the bishop. And there were angry words and angry deeds. And the last of them was a crowd of monks that dragged her through the streets and killed her. But she was, well, the last of the Neoplatonists, and with her...
She was an initiate too, wasn't she?
Well, and yes, and we should say what that means. It means that in the mysteries, she was shown some of that wisdom in a direct experience. And it was the end of, almost the end of that entire tradition, because it was only 13, 14, 12 years later that the Emperor Justinian closed all of the academies, including that in Athens, which had been there for 1,000 years, since the time of Plato.
She was also a mathematician in her own right.
She was a mathematician, and her father, Theon, was a wonderfully accomplished mathematician, and she corrected and annotated some of his work. That's how good she was as a mathematician. But there was a movie only a few years ago about her. I don't know how well it was done.
It was not well done.
Was it not well done?
It was a B movie.
Was it a B movie?
It was atrocious. But
well, thank you for sharing that.
At least you get some idea. And although it had a very good actress, the script was just atrocious. B movie.
Ah, okay.
But maybe you want to see it just once.
Just once? Well, it would, I guess, give us a different idea. It's nice that a woman of her caliber, because she was widely regarded as not just a mathematician, but a wonderfully spiritual and, well, a strikingly beautiful woman, but also widely respected by all the scholars, by all the, by all sides. And at that time in Alexandria, there were sides. There were the pagans, and there were the Christians. And even the Christians had a lot of respect for her. But a mob got out of hand, and she was caught and killed. Most unfortunate end, and symbolically, actually, marks, in a sense, the end of the ancient world and the beginning of the Middle Ages, what we would call the Dark Ages. If one wanted to use that rather overused phrase, which is really a Renaissance term for the period from the 6th century AD to the 16th century AD, that 1,000 years that in Western Europe was so full of pain. Well, we're all but finished tonight. I do have a little handout. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to read it, but we took some excerpts from Isis Unveiled, a couple of things from The Secret Doctrine, and from Blavatsky's Theosophical Glossary that you might take with you. And just as reference on some of the things that we talked about tonight, perhaps some of it will be a little better explained than I've been able to, but if we could share some of these around, it would be great. And it kind of gives one gives us a bit of a flavor of that first chapter of the second volume in Isis, and gives some hints perhaps as to where we might go in our own studies if this is something that is of interest. We thank you for your attention, your comments, your questions, always welcome. And next week, where did December go? Here we are, December. We'll be back. The rest of our program, of course, is in the handout, but it's program. Next week, December 7th, the subject, desire, compassion, will. Whole lot different than Isis Unveiled, but in the same way.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.